Hey guys, Paul Warburg back in Utah today. I'm changing up my normal pattern and filming from my basement today because a little birdie tells me there's ATACMs missiles flying around all over the sky tonight. And of course that means that any minute now a Russian nuke should be hitting my city in retaliation. Now obviously I'm joking, but ATACMs missiles are why I'm filming from my basement tonight. Because we got some exciting news today that we have been waiting for a long time. And I did not want to wait until tomorrow to publish this analysis. If you've been watching the news, you no doubt have heard that today the United States finally unlocked ATACMs missiles for Ukraine to use them against Russian military targets on Russian territory, which is something that people who have been watching the war in Ukraine closely and have been looking at the strategic situation on the ground have been asking for and hoping for several years. So for today's video, I want to analyze that decision, and I want to talk about why this decision is so important, how this decision will impact the war in Ukraine as a whole, and why this decision is being made now. Because the timing, of course, is rather interesting. For Joe Biden to authorize the use of ATACMs missiles after the US presidential election and before Donald Trump, the next president, takes office. As you've come to expect from my videos, I am sure there will be some details here that you probably will not be hearing anywhere else. As with every analysis, it helps to first establish a baseline of the facts before moving on to the implications. So let's start first by very briefly discussing the basics of this decision and the background behind it. As we all know, the United States has been providing aid to Ukraine throughout its conflict with Russia. But up to this point, the United States has been providing that aid with a few major restrictions. And the most major of those restrictions is that while the US is willing to give some military aid to Ukraine, it is not willing, or at least has not been willing, to allow Ukraine to use that aid to strike targets on Russian territory. The war in Ukraine, of course, has two major potential theaters. The first one is obviously Ukrainian territory itself, or Russian-occupied Ukrainian territory, where Russian soldiers are stationed that Ukraine is trying to kick out to take its land back. The second potential theater is Russia itself. But the US has, up to this point, been making the decision to only allow Ukraine to use US-provided weapons against Russian military targets on Ukrainian territory that Russians are occupying. And this has created a tactical imbalance in this war that is actually why the war is casually called the war in Ukraine, rather than its proper name, the Russo-Ukrainian War. Because the reality is that the US not allowing Ukraine to use its weapons on Russian territory has created a practical situation where the vast majority of the fighting and the vast majority of the destruction is centered around the territory of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. Up to this point, by Ukraine not being allowed to use all of their weapons against targets freely the way that Russia does, it has given Russia numerous tactical options that Ukraine does not have access to. Not because of a lack of capability, not because of a lack of intelligence, not because of a lack of willpower, not because of a lack of strategy, but because of a lack of political allowance. For example, Russia several times has been allowed to mass up troops on Russian territory outside of major Ukrainian cities. Troops that are basically easy targets that should be easily disrupted under normal wartime circumstances. But because Ukraine has not been allowed to strike these targets with American weapons, these troops have been able to mass up in unnatural ways and move forward for major offensives. Now, of course, on the flip side, if Ukraine were ever to attempt to do the same thing, Russia would target them with impunity. Because Russia does not have these kinds of restrictions on their weapons. Not only are they allowed to strike Ukrainian military targets wherever Ukrainian military targets might be, but they are also allowed to strike Ukrainian civilian targets, including not just infrastructure targets, but actual things like residential buildings, apartment buildings, things that are meant to terrorize the Ukrainian population and break their willpower, while at the same time, the Russian civilians and even the Russian military at home is able to sleep basically safely in their beds. Another tactical disparity that this has created is that Russia has been able to target Ukrainian cities with Russian aircraft carrying glide bombs that are being fired from Russian territory. And Russia is able to do this because for a long time, the airfields that these aircraft were operating from, even though they were within range of US-provided ATACMs and Storm Shadow missiles, were not allowed to be struck because of US military policy. And that basically allowed these glide bombs to destroy several Ukrainian cities and entire Ukrainian towns, with Ukraine having the intelligence and the capability to stop that from happening, but not the permission to. Now already, because this permission has come so slowly, Russia has been able to move these glide bombers to airfields that are deeper within Russian territory, that are now out of range of US Storm Shadow and ATACMs missiles. So it's basically a missed opportunity where we had a juicy, easy tactical target that was unable to be executed upon. And a lot of people have been very frustrated by the fact that the US has been so slow to make this decision, but one person who has not been frustrated, of course, is Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin, throughout the entire war, but especially over the past year or so, has been really ramping up the pressure for the US not to ever give Ukraine permission to use their weapons on Russian territory. And the reason Putin has been doing this is because Ukraine not having this permission is basically one of Russia's few remaining tactical advantages in this war. Up to this point, Russia has already squandered basically every advantage that they had. They have squandered their ability to bring more soldiers to the fight than Ukraine. They have squandered their stockpiles of equipment, which are now basically sitting as rusting hulks in Ukrainian fields because they've all been destroyed. And they've also squandered their advantage of surprise when they first entered Ukrainian territory because the thing was so poorly organized and there was so much corruption that the whole campaign basically eroded. So for Russia, looking at this war and hoping to win, their only significant remaining advantage over Ukraine has been, for the past year or so, the fact that they have these tactical options that Ukraine doesn't have. So they can basically take pot shots at Ukraine and continue hammering them in ways that Ukraine can't effectively respond to. Now, because these things are so significant to Putin's current strategy, he has, of course, tried to do everything in his power to prevent the US from giving Ukraine permission. And so to do that, he has threatened everything from vague threats of escalation to pretty specific innuendos of nuclear warfare, which is why I made the joke that I made at the beginning of this video. But of course, nukes haven't flown yet, and I've already covered extensively in other videos why nukes are not going to fly in response to this. Because the reality is, when you see somebody like this who's backed into a corner and trying to do everything they can to prevent you from taking a specific option, it's because obviously they feel vulnerable if that option is executed against. So the fact that Putin is so desperately trying to defend this tactical option shows that one of the things Putin fears more than anything is that US weapons would be unlocked for use against Russian military targets on Russian territory. Because Putin knows that if this happens, it could very quickly push over the edge the Russian economy, Russian industrial complex, Russian military that is already shaking and pretty close to falling over. So that background in mind, hopefully it's now clear why this decision today for the US to finally give Ukraine this permission is so significant. But one question that a lot of people are asking is, this is great, but isn't this just too little, too late, and will these missiles actually make a difference on the battlefield? Now, I already mentioned earlier that unfortunately, because the US was so slow to give this permission, that Russia has had the opportunity to move a lot of the juiciest targets out of range of these US missile strikes. And a lot of people looking at this situation have developed a sort of attitude around this that basically says, these missile strikes aren't going to be useful at all, it's all just a waste. And I want to say that I actually don't think that's true, and I actually don't really like that attitude. Because what it is doing is complaining about the opportunities that were lost, instead of looking at the opportunities that still remain on the table. Complaining about opportunities that you can't execute on anymore isn't going to help anybody. But looking strategically at the opportunities that remain can help a lot. And the reality is that the US giving Ukraine this permission is still very strategically significant. For example, even if we just look at these airfields that are allowing Russian airplanes to launch glide bombs on Ukrainian cities, just because these airfields have now been moved to the point that they are out of range of American missiles, doesn't mean that American missiles can't still indirectly destroy these airfields. And the reason for that is that Russia's air defense systems have already been shown to have significant holes in the current state of the battlefield. And those holes are only going to get worse as Russia now has to consider how to defend all of their territory from American long-range missile strikes. What this is going to do is it's going to create a lot more holes, a lot more gaps that Ukrainian drones can then use and leverage to get in and destroy more of Russia's crucial infrastructure. And so even if the missiles themselves aren't able to hit a lot of that infrastructure, Ukraine's long-range drones definitely can. And that infrastructure can range anywhere from refineries that US missiles might not be allowed to strike directly, but that Ukrainian drones still can, or they could range even to those airfields that I discussed earlier. Of course, even beyond that, there are still plenty of useful targets that ATACMs and Storm Shadow missiles can still strike. In fact, sometime back, the Institute for the Study of War did a study and found that there were at least 200 different critical Russian military targets that could be struck relatively quickly if this permission was given to Ukraine. And those targets include some very critical targets like the Russian military facilities in Rostov-on-Don, which sits a little bit to the southeast of Crimea, southeast of Ukraine on Russian territory. And this is where Russian logistical planning centers are. This is where a lot of the battlefield control is happening. And so Ukraine can now take out a lot of Russian officers. And it's possible that even by the time I post this video, they may already have done so. However, most immediately, this permission also unlocks something else for Ukraine, which is what I want to now pivot to and have a discussion about why is this permission being given to Ukraine now, a couple of weeks after the US presidential election, and a couple of months before the next US president comes into office. One of the things I already mentioned was that Ukraine not having permission to strike Russian military targets on Russian territory means that Russia is able to combine forces and mass up troops in a way that Ukraine could disrupt but isn't allowed to. And right now, where we see Russia massing up forces and massing up troops is in the Kursk region of Russia. The Kursk region of Russia is, of course, the region that Ukraine has captured a piece of from Russia. And it's the region where Vladimir Putin has deployed the North Korean troops that have been sent by North Korea to the conflict. It's also a region that Vladimir Putin has set an objective to basically take back at any cost, presumably before the next US presidential election. And so basically the Biden administration giving Ukraine permission to use these missiles right now is to try to give Ukraine a chance to hold on to this Kursk region long enough so that if an end to the war is sort of forced to be negotiated, Ukraine can still hold on to what is probably one of its best bargaining chips. By giving Ukraine permission to use these missiles now, they can begin to break up some of these massive clusters of troops and cause chaos in the Russian military at home, which is going to make the war really interesting and somewhat gruesome to watch for the next month or so. However, there's also another additional reason that the Biden administration might have chosen this specific timing. And that actually goes back to thinking through the logic of why the Biden administration hasn't given permission in the first place. Which is that President Biden, for better or for worse, has an incredibly low tolerance for risk. And everything about his approach to the war in Ukraine is about risk management and preventing Putin from escalating the war. With that in mind, this timing is very strategic. As I've said, Putin has threatened major escalation if the US gave Ukraine this permission. But the reality is that this is going to be something that it is very hard for Putin and the Kremlin to execute against as they anticipate a new president coming into office. A president that they might hope is going to bring about an end to the war that is favorable to them. The idea is that Putin and the Kremlin, the last thing they want right now is to do anything that will turn American public opinion even further against Russia, because that will ruin their whole plan. And even further than that, it is a little bit silly to retaliate against a presidential administration that is only going to be there for another month or so. Because when the new president comes into office, it's a whole new show, and maybe things will work out in your favor. So there's basically this Goldilocks period right now where the US can take major escalatory action with a very low risk of Russia escalating back. Now, that's not to say there was a high risk of Russian escalation in the first place. Another thing that people have been worried about is that once Ukraine gets this permission, is that Russia will retaliate by, for example, hitting logistics centers in Europe that are used to deliver further missiles to Ukraine. And this is sort of a fear-mongering theory that, if you think about it, just has no basis in reality. We've already covered how the reason that Putin is threatening against these actions is because he knows these actions will be devastating to Russia. And so the last thing that Putin can risk right now is to conduct a strike on a European country like Poland, even just a logistics center, that could result in much larger scale NATO retaliation, perhaps even boots on the ground. So Putin is not going to do anything in response to the US giving Ukraine this permission right now. And that is what makes this timing so brilliant. Obviously, earlier would have been better. A lot earlier would have been better. But right now is a pretty darn good time. All of that in mind, the timing does bring up a question in a lot of people's minds, which is that, is this support going to be lasting if Donald Trump enters into office and immediately changes the US policy decision? And that is a good question. However, that question may or may not actually matter. The reality is that the US is not the only country that has been kind of holding back this permission from Ukraine. There are a couple of countries, especially the UK and France, that have been sort of waiting for the US to make this decision for them to probably step over the line and make the same decision. Now that the US has acted first, these countries might contribute their resources. And even if Donald Trump comes into office and changes the US policy right away, these countries' policies are likely to be sticky. So basically what has happened is we have opened up the gateway to a further level of support that is probably not going to go away. One thing I should have mentioned earlier in the video is, of course, that there are other countries that already have given Ukraine this permission in the past. But the difference is that these are countries like Sweden, with very small industrial bases, that while this support is meaningful, it's not game-changing by itself. What we're seeing now is the same support in potentially much, much larger numbers, with some of the biggest militaries in the world getting behind Ukraine in this way. That is definitely going to make a difference on the battlefield. Whether or not it will win the war for Ukraine remains to be decided. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I'm going to continue to watch this situation, so be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for further updates on this topic. And also be sure to check out these other videos on screen that, if you liked this video, you're probably going to like these analyses as well. Thanks, guys. See you on the next one.